Position of women in India. The position of women in ancient India has been a very complicated one because of the paradoxical statements in different religious scriptures and sometimes in the same text at different places. Some have described their status as equals to men, while others have held not only in disrespect but even in positive hatred. This is why it has presented many problems to sociologists while evaluating women's status in India. The cultural history of India reveals that in India, theoretically women enjoyed the status of Devi, goddess, as described in many religious texts of Hindus, the majority community in India. The woman enjoyed the theoretical importance which these texts outline for the wife who was defined Ardhanjini, better half, but in practice she had a subservient position than man. She was regarded as a chattel, a corporal movable property, with no rights. In brief, she had no personality of her own. Some scholars have explained this inferior status of women as a result of patriarchal code of living. The rigid codes of behavior as outlined for women in Brahmanical texts were also responsible for the low status of women in India. In the following paragraphs we will survey, in brief, the position of women in India from Rigvedic period to modern times. Rigvedic period. It is generally upheld on the basis of the instances depicted in religious texts, e.g., Vedas, Upanishads, Smritis, epics like Ramayana and Mahabharata and other Dharmasastras, that in ancient India, especially in Rigvedic period, women enjoyed equal status with men. They had an honorable place in the society. They were not secluded from men and freely participated in public life. They attended great assemblies and state occasions. They studied the Vedas and composed hymns. They also distinguished themselves in science and learning at their times. They were considered intellectual companies of their husbands, as the friends and loving helpers in the journey of life of their partners in their religious duties and the center of their domestic bliss. In Vedic times, women were not treated as inferior or subordinate but equal to men in all matters of life. They were given education and had a voice in the selection of their husband. Marriage was regarded as a religious bond. Child marriage was unknown. Often there were love marriages known as Gandhar Vivaha. Monogamy was a general rule. Polygamy was almost unknown. The references in the Rigveda to the life of a widow are very few, but it was not characterized by restrictions and austerities as in the post-Vedic days. Remarriage of widows was allowed. There are a number of references to the custom of Niyoga where a brother of the deceased husband or any other person could marry the widow. Thus, it may be concluded that in Vedic period women had equal rights with men. Their status was fairly high and they were treated as equals with men in almost all spheres of life. Post-Vedic period, Upanishads, Puranic and Smriti periods. The position enjoyed by women in Vedic period deteriorated in post-Vedic period. It was gradually degraded in the Puranic and Smriti periods. The description of position before BC 300 shows that she enjoyed a fairly high status, though not to the extent that she enjoyed in Vedic period. It appears that several drastic changes that took place in the Indian society from about BC 300 to the beginning of the Christian era led to the curtailment of freedom of women, imposition of Brahminical rules and code of conduct, rigid restrictions imposed by caste system and joint family system were the main reasons for lowering of status in this period. Post-Vedic period, Upanishads, Puranic and Smriti periods. The position enjoyed by women in Vedic period deteriorated in post-Vedic period. It was gradually degraded in the Puranic and Smriti periods. The description of position before BC 300 shows that she enjoyed a fairly high status, though not to the extent that she enjoyed in Vedic period. It appears that several drastic changes that took place in the Indian society from about BC 300 to the beginning of the Christian era led to the curtailment of freedom of women, imposition of Brahminical rules and code of conduct, rigid restrictions imposed by caste system and joint family system were the main reasons for lowering of status in this period. Just to refer one instance of Mahabharata, it is said that there was no creature more sinful than man, woman is the root of all ills. This simple quotation is sufficient to prove that how disrespect was shown towards women. However, it is not out of place to mention here that Indian scriptures are full of paradoxical statements. At one place, women were regarded as goddess, held in high esteem, where at other place in the same scripture, in some other context, they were regarded no better than just slaves or chattels. Disregarding what was practiced at any particular time, the ancient Indian scriptures and documents, Mahabharata, Ramayana, Vedic hymns, and various codes of the law of Manu, gave women a very high and protected place in their basic moral codes. Medieval period. The period between 11th century to 18th century witnessed further deterioration in the position of women due to the impact of Muslim culture. In this period, female infanticide, child marriage, purdah system, sati and slavery were the main social evils affecting the position of women. The birth of a female child began to be regarded as curse, a bad luck. They were almost confined to the doors of their homes. There was further curtailment of freedom of women in matters of education, mate selection, public appearances, etc. Purdah system came to be rigorously followed. Women education was almost banned. More and more feeling of conservatism increased about women. She not only continued to hold low status in and outside home, rather her position worsened in this period. It is often said that in India the purdah, veil, system came into existence only after the arrival of Mughals. A.S. Altekar, in his book, The Position of Women in Hindu Civilization, 1962, writes, this for nearly 2,000 years from BC 20 to 1800 AD, the position of women steadily deteriorated, though she was fondled by the parents, loved by the husband and revered by her children. The revival of sati, the prohibition of remarriage, the spread of purdah and the greater prevalence of polygamy made her position very bad. Thus, there was a vast difference between the status of women in the early Vedic period and the subsequent periods, stretching from post-Vedic to the medieval period. The dual standards of morality set by Manu Smriti and other Smritis continue to prevail right up to now, though some changes are visible in urban educated women. British period. During the period of British rule of about 200 years, early 18th century to the first half of 20th century, some substantial progress was achieved in eliminating inequalities between men and women in matters of education, employment, social and property rights and so forth. Sati, purdah, female infanticide, child marriage, inheritance, slavery, prohibition of widow remarriage and the lack of women's rights in different fields were some of the problems which attracted the attention of British Raj, though the British rulers initially decided not to interfere with the traditional social fabric of Indian people, Hindus, and as such they took no steps to bring any change in the status of women in India. It is only in the latter half of the 19th century and the first quarter of the 20th century that they took some steps to abolish or change some social customs through legislative measures. For such measures incentive was provided to them by some social reformers, such as Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Ishvar Chandra Vijayasagar, Dayanand Sarasvati, Keshab Chandra Sen, Swami Vivekanand, Maharishi Karve, Justice Ranade, Mahatma Gandhi and others. Through the efforts and the various movements launched by these great social leaders of the 19th century before independence, it had been possible to get many legislations passed and public opinion mobilized in favor of some issues of social reforms. The most significant legislations relating to the problems faced by the Indian Hindu women passed during British period were as follows. 1. Abolition of Sati Act, 1813. 2. The Hindu Widow Remarriage Act, 1856. 3. Civil Marriage Act, 1872. 4. Married Women's Property Act, 1874. 5. The Child Marriage Restraint Act, Sharda Act, 1929. 6. Hindu Law of Inheritance Act, 1929. 7. Hindu Women's Rights to Property Act, 1939. 8. Hindu Marriage Disabilities Removal Act, 1946. After independence. In addition to the measures to uplift the status of women in India initiated by Britishers, many vigorous steps, legal, social, economic and political, have been taken by Government of India after independence by removing the hurdles put in their way by traditional past. The efforts of the social reformers and their movements launched in the pre-independence period also bore fruits. The Indian national movement also led to the emancipation of Indian women. The leaders of the national movement realized that the liberation of the country from the bondage of imperialism was impossible without the active participation of women who constituted half of the population of the country. The decades after independence have seen tremendous changes in the status and position of the women in Indian society. The Constitution of India has laid down as a fundamental right the equality of sexes. But, the change from a position of utter degradation of women to a position of Equality is not a simple case of the progress of women in the modern era. To uplift the status of women, many legislations pertaining to women were enacted after independence. These were mainly related to marriage, divorce, inheritance of property and employment. Some of the important acts are mentioned below. 1. The Hindu Marriage Validity Act, 1949. 2. The Special Marriage Act, 1954. 3. The Hindu Marriage Act, 1955, amended in 1986 and 2010. 4. The Hindu Succession Act, 1956. 5. Immoral Traffic, Prevention, Act, 1956. 6. The Sati Prevention Act, 1987. 7. The Dowry Prohibition Act, 1961. 8. Indecent Representation of Women, Prohibition, Act, 1986. 9. Prohibition of Child Marriage Act, 2007. 10. Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, 2005. 11. Compulsory Registration of Marriage Act, 2006. Besides, the acts especially related to employment are: 1. The Factory Act, 1948. 2. Employees Insurance Act, 1948. 3. The Maternity Benefit Act, 1961. 4. The Equal Remuneration Act, 1976. The above legislations and many other emancipatory actions of the social reformers have no doubt raised the status of women in India, but still much is to be done in this field. The institution of bigamy, men marrying any number of women, has almost come to an end. If detected, it has become a punishable offense. Today, both sexes have the right to a civil marriage. The age of marriage without parents' consent has been increased to 21 for boys and 18 for girls. Thus, monogamy along with facility of judicial separation, nullity and divorce, even on mutual consent, inheritance, equal share in paternal property, adoption, widow remarriage and sati abolition are some of the salient features of post-independence era which put men and women on equal footings from the point of view of legislative measures.